Alright, this is the second video for fractions. And in this video, we're going to be talking about day 7 through day 13 of our fractions. And those two TEKs are 4.3c, determine if two fractions are equivalent, and 4.3d, compare two fractions with different numerators and different denominators and represent the comparison using symbols. Alright, so as we begin this on day 7, we are going to actually review what students did in 3rd grade. When we compare fractions, in 3rd grade they learned 3 ways to compare fractions. First of all, they learned to compare unit fractions. So that meant if I had 1/3 and 1/4, 1/3 is larger than 1/4 because my part, when something's broken up into 3 parts, those parts are larger than if it's broken up into 4 parts, right? So we're going to review that with students. We're also going to review comparing fractions with common numerators. Let's start with denominators first. I'm spelling it wrong. So I can say I have 2/4 here, and I want to compare it to 1/4, right? So of course I have 2/4 and 1/4. If I have 2 of the same size parts, definitely it's going to be larger than me having 1 of the same size parts. Okay. Then students in 3rd grade learn to compare fractions with common numerators. So they said, what if I had 2/4 and I'm comparing it to 2/3? Which one's going to be larger? And here students have to once again reason about the size of the denominator. In other words, I know that a part broken up into 4 pieces, these pieces are going to be smaller than thirds. So therefore, thirds will be larger than fourths, and I have 2 parts of each of them, so 2/3 is larger than 2/4. Okay? So that really is day 1 of comparing fractions because I want you to go back and make sure they have a good foundation and understanding of this. Because these are 3 ways students can see fractions to compare in 4th grade. Okay? All right, the next day you're going to jump into another strategy students can use to compare, and that is to look at the fraction and kind of look and see what the benchmark fraction is that is closest to it. Okay, so for instance, I have my whole here and I have a half here. So let's say I wanted to compare let's say 4/8. I'm going to get out 4/8 here. Maybe if I can find them. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to get out 4/8 and I'm going to ask myself, is 4/8 closer to a whole, closer to a half, or closer to 0? Well, when I use the manipulatives, I can see that it is exactly 1/2. So I'm going to put that above 4/8. It is closer to 1/2. It actually is 1/2. And I encourage you, when you find fractions, as you're first working through this with students, when you find fractions that are equivalent to 1/2 or 1 whole, make sure you write those down somewhere in the room that students can see them, because you're going to want to come back and talk to them when we talk about equivalent fractions the next day. You're going to want to come back to them and say, what do you notice about all the fractions that equal or are equivalent to 1/2 or to 1/2? All right, so I know that. So let's say I want to compare that to 2/3. Okay, so I put my 2/3 down. And once again, I have to ask myself, is it closer to 0? Is it closer to 1/2? Or is it closer to whole? Well, with this one, it's past 1/2. I can see that. I'm not quite sure it's at a whole yet, or closer to a whole, but I know it's past 1/2, and 4/8 is past 1/2. So I can put a whole 4/8 is 1/2, so I can put a whole. So I know that 2/3 is greater than 4/8. Okay. So want to continue your anchor chart here with students, because you want them to have, like I said, a multitude of strategies to compare numbers. And these are all the different strategies we're going to use. All right, day 9, once you get finished with that, you're going to create equivalent fractions. And the reason you're going to teach students to create equivalent fractions is because they need it when they start talking about common denominators, for us to compare common denominators. So when I create equivalent fractions, I may want to start off with something like this, and I may want to find an equivalent fraction to 1/2, let's say. Okay, is equal to 4/8. And I'm going to ask students to notice and wonder about the numbers. And I'm hoping, and if students don't do this, you can do it. You can say, well, what could I do to 2 to get 8? And they may say, well, you multiply by 4, or if a student says that, so what can I do to 1 to get 4? Well, you multiply by 4. So to create an equivalent fraction, let's, you're like, oh, I wonder if that works. Well, that always create an equivalent fraction. So let's see. What about, that one won't work. Let's do a 1/4 and a 1/4. So 1/2 is equal to 2/4. So what did I do to 2 to get 4? I multiplied it by 2. And what did I do to 1 to get 2? I multiplied it by 2. So it looks like, if I continue this pattern, that if I want to create any equivalent fraction, all I have to do is take my first fraction and multiply the numerator and the denominator by the same number. So I could try this out, and I could say, well, what about, what if I wanted to do, I'm going to multiply each one by 8. I'm just going to be silly. Well, that's 8/16. Let's see if that works. Is that true? And so we could put down our 16ths. So these fraction bars, I absolutely love them. I had my kids create them. I don't recommend creating the book, because you cannot manipulate the book like this. Yes, it's a lot of pieces. Yes, students can lose them. I always had them put their initials on the back of the piece, each individual piece. That way, if I found one on the floor after lesson, I knew which student it belonged to. All right, so I put my 16ths there. Do I have 8 of them? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I do. So you know what? I think this rule makes sense, that anytime I multiply a fraction by the same number in the numerator and the denominator, it creates an equivalent fraction, okay? Now, we all created just fractions that were equivalent to 1/2. So what do we notice about those fractions that are equivalent to 1/2? As I said previously, we want to make sure we write those down so kids can see it. And what we notice is that if I double the number in the numerator, it gives me the number in the denominator, okay? So it very clearly creates that pattern for me. So anytime I see a fraction, whether it be 50 hundredths or 25 50s or 7/14, I know that those fractions are all equivalent to 1/2 because I can double the numerator and get the denominator, okay? Same thing with a whole. We want to make sure our students understand 8/8 is a whole, 7/7 is a whole, 6/6 is a whole, and so forth, all right? All right, so the next day, once we do some work with equivalent fractions and talk about how we can create equivalent fractions, we're then going to talk about how can I create or use common denominators, or create, I guess I should put that first, create common denominators to make sure to compare fractions. So let's say I have 3/7 and I have 2/8. Okay, well, I can't use a unit fraction, I can't use common denominators, I can't use common numerators. Both of them are less than 1/2. So I really don't know which one's closest to 0, so this is a great instance where I really need to create a common denominator, okay? So to create a common denominator, the easiest way is to take my two fractions and look at their denominators and multiply the other fraction by that denominator. So 3/8, I would multiply the numerator and the denominator by 8. And 2/8, I would multiply the numerator and the denominator by 7. So 3 times 8 is 24, 7 times 8 is 56, 2 times 7 is 14, 8 times 7 is 56. I can tell right now, I have common denominators, so now I can look at the numerators and say that 24 is larger than 14, okay? All right. So that is your week. That is actually the first, that's day 7, 8, 9, and 10. You slowly create this anchor chart for how to compare fractions. And then on day 11, 12, and 13, you are practicing. You are giving students fractions to compare, and they are going down this list and using this list to help them figure out where they need to be. What's interesting to me is a lot of times, by the time you get to 4, students don't even have to create common denominators, because if they can reason about their sizes in 1 through 4, 5 is usually, creating a common denominator is not the things that students normally have to do. Normally they can reason about the size of the fractions before they have to do that. All right, last thing I'm going to say about comparing fractions is please do not use any kind of trick. Do not teach students the butterfly method. We are really getting away from that because it is just a algorithm that students are doing without understanding the meaning. So we are definitely going to go through the steps of multiplying the numerator and the denominator by the same number to create those common denominators. Because I know all of us want to create meaning and conceptualization with the content with our students and not just tricks. All right, in our next video, we'll talk about adding and subtracting fractions, and we'll also talk about fractions on a number line.